The line outside the event was buzzing with excitement, filled with chatter, laughter, and the occasional squeal of anticipation. Families, teenagers, and even a few elderly fans had gathered early, eager to catch a glimpse of Barron Trump. Despite being a private individual for the most part, Barron had become something of a quiet enigma, capturing the curiosity of many people for his reserved demeanor and rare public appearances. But for one young girl, meeting him was more than just a passing dream. It was something she had waited for months to make happen. Emma was only 14 years old, but had already faced more challenges in life than many people twice her age. She was soft-spoken, with sparkling green eyes that seemed to hold on to a hope she never let go of, even in her hardest moments. Emma's family had been through a rough few years, and she had learned to find comfort in little things, like watching interviews or stories about people she admired. For reasons she couldn't quite explain, Barron Trump had become someone she looked up to. Perhaps it was his ability to carry himself with grace despite the immense pressure of public scrutiny, or maybe it was his quiet confidence that reminded her to stay strong when life got tough. Whatever it was, Emma had decided she needed to meet him. The moment she heard about the event, Emma begged her mom to take her. It wasn't exactly a quick trip. They lived several hours away. But her mom, seeing how much it meant to her, agreed to make it happen. Emma spent weeks planning everything, what she would wear, what she would say, and even what gift she would bring for him. She decided on a small sketch she had drawn herself, a picture of Barron standing under a big tree with the words, "Stay strong," etched into the bark. It wasn't much, but to Emma, it was a way to express how much his resilience inspired her to keep going. As the line grew longer and the sun began to climb higher in the sky, Emma clutched the sketch nervously, wondering if she would get the chance to hand it to him. She had never been to an event like this before, and the crowds made her feel a little overwhelmed. But her mom squeezed her hand reassuringly, and Emma smiled, reminding herself that this was a moment she had been waiting for. The closer she got to the front of the line, the more her nerves kicked in. What if he didn't notice her? What if she froze up and couldn't say a word? She had replayed this meeting in her head 100 times, but now that it was almost here, she couldn't help but feel small and unsure. Still, she refused to let her fear get the best of her. She reminded herself of everything she had been through, and how this was her chance to thank someone who unknowingly had helped her find a little bit of strength when she needed it most. Finally, after what felt like hours, Emma reached the front of the line. Her heart pounded so loudly, she could barely hear the chatter around her. And then there he was, taller than she had imagined, with a kind but slightly reserved expression. Barron Trump was shaking hands and exchanging polite words with the people ahead of her, and Emma could see that he was gracious, even when faced with the overwhelming attention of so many fans. When it was her turn, Emma stepped forward cautiously, her hands trembling as she held out the sketch. For a split second, she couldn't speak, frozen by a mix of excitement and nerves. But then Barron looked at her, his expression softening as he noticed her trembling hands. "What's this?" he asked, his voice calm and warm. Emma took a deep breath, finally finding her voice. "I drew this for you," she said, her words coming out in a rush. "You've helped me a lot, even if you don't know it. I just wanted to say thank you." Barron took the sketch from her hands, his eyes scanning the delicate lines of the drawing. His expression shifted, and for a moment, Emma couldn't tell what he was thinking. Was he moved? Was he just being polite? The silence stretched on for what felt like forever, and Emma began to worry that maybe she had said too much or done something wrong. But then something unexpected happened. Barron looked back at her, a genuine smile breaking across his face, and what he did next left Emma, and everyone around her, absolutely stunned. The rain poured steadily that evening, drenching the cracked sidewalks and dimly lit streets of a quiet neighborhood. Inside a small, cozy apartment, the Williams family sat huddled in their living room. Laughter echoed softly as they shared stories, warmed by the glow of a flickering lamp and the smell of spaghetti simmering on the stove. For the Williams family, Monica, a hardworking single mom, and her two children, Mia and Jordan, life wasn't extravagant, but it was filled with love, hope, and dreams of a brighter future. But that evening, something darker loomed just outside their front door. A knock came, sharp and insistent. Monica's heart sank, sensing trouble. She opened the door cautiously to find Mr. Green, their landlord, standing there with a sour expression and a letter in his hand. "Eviction notice," he barked, thrusting the paper toward her. Monica froze, the words not registering at first. "I don't understand," she stammered. "We're paid up. There's no reason." "There doesn't have to be," he snapped, cutting her off. His tone was cold, his smirk faintly condescending. "It's my property, and I've decided I want it back. 30 days, Ms. Williams. 30 days to pack up and leave." Monica's voice wavered, her confusion quickly turning to anger. "You can't just throw us out like this. My kids, our lives are here." But Green was unmoved. He turned on his heel, muttering under his breath, something Monica couldn't quite make out. It sounded like, "People like you shouldn't be here anyway." The words stung, even if they weren't entirely clear. As the door slammed shut, Monica leaned against it, her hands trembling. Mia and Jordan peered around the corner, their young faces etched with worry. "What's wrong, Mom?" Mia asked, her voice small and unsure. Monica forced a reassuring smile, though tears welled in her eyes. "Nothing we can't handle, baby," she said softly. But deep down, she knew the road ahead would be anything but easy. The next few days were a whirlwind of stress and uncertainty. Monica scoured through rental listings, but the prices were sky high, and landlords often hesitated when they saw her income. Despite her steady job at the local diner and impeccable record as a tenant, doors kept closing in her face. Word of their struggles spread through the neighborhood, and support trickled in from friends and coworkers. Yet no one could provide a lasting solution. To make matters worse, Mr. Green began showing up unannounced, looming outside the apartment, checking his watch, and reminding them of their deadline. His behavior wasn't just intimidating, it felt deeply personal. One afternoon, Monica caught him muttering to a neighbor about keeping the neighborhood clean. The neighbor glanced at Monica uncomfortably and quickly changed the subject, but the damage was done. The words confirmed Monica's deepest fear. This wasn't just about the apartment. It was about them. With time running out, Monica felt the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. She tried to shield Mia and Jordan from the harsh reality, but they could see the strain in her eyes. The once lively home grew quiet, the laughter replaced by whispered worries and sleepless nights. Then, on a particularly bleak morning, a glimmer of hope arrived in the most unexpected way. Monica had taken the kids to a nearby park, hoping the fresh air might lift their spirits. As they sat on a bench, sharing a modest picnic, an unfamiliar voice broke through the stillness. "Excuse me, ma'am," the young man said, his tone polite but curious. He was tall, with a clean-cut appearance and an air of quiet confidence. "I couldn't help but overhear. Is everything all right?" Monica hesitated. She didn't usually open up to strangers, but there was something disarming about him, something genuine. Before she knew it, she found herself explaining their situation. The eviction, the challenges of finding a new place, and the underlying prejudice that made it all so much harder. The man listened intently, his brow furrowing as she spoke. "That's unacceptable," he said firmly. "No one should have to go through that." Monica was taken aback by his empathy. "Thank you," she said softly, though she didn't expect anything more than kind words. But the man wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone and started typing, his expression serious. "My name's Barron," he said, "and I think I can help." Monica blinked, unsure if she'd heard him correctly. Could this stranger, this young man who seemed worlds apart from their struggles, really mean what he said? As he walked away, promising to be in touch soon, Monica felt a flicker of hope she hadn't felt in weeks. She didn't know who he was or what he could do, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like they weren't alone in this fight. The silence in the classroom was unbearable. Elise stood there, still clutching the chalk in her trembling hand, her eyes scanning the room nervously. Her classmates, who moments earlier had been whispering and snickering, now exchanged stunned glances. Even the usual troublemakers in the back row didn't dare make a sound. Mrs. Grayson's expression shifted slowly, her sharp features tightening into something Elise couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger, more like disbelief, mixed with a tinge of embarrassment. The teacher took a step closer to the board, squinting at the solution as if searching for a mistake. But there wasn't one. Every number, every calculation, every tiny step of the process was flawless. "Sit down," Mrs. Grayson said finally, her voice unusually quiet. Elise nodded and returned to her seat, the knot in her chest loosening just slightly. She could still feel the weight of everyone's stares, but this time there was no laughter, no mockery. For the rest of the class, Mrs. Grayson carried on as if nothing had happened, her tone brisk and authoritative. But she avoided looking at Elise. It was as though acknowledging what had just happened would somehow unravel her carefully maintained control. After the bell rang and the students spilled out into the hallway, Elise grabbed her bag and tried to slip out unnoticed. She didn't want to be cornered by her classmates, didn't want to deal with the questions or the sudden attention. But just as she reached the door, she heard Mrs. Grayson's voice behind her. "Miss Hart, a word, please." Elise froze. Slowly, she turned around to face her teacher, who was now standing by her desk, arms crossed. "Yes, ma'am?" Elise asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Grayson studied her for a moment, her sharp eyes narrowing. "That solution," she said, nodding toward the board. "Did you come up with that on your own?" "Yes," Elise replied, her voice steady. Mrs. Grayson's lips pressed into a thin line. "I see. Well, it seems I've underestimated you. Don't let it go to your head." Elise wasn't sure how to respond, so she simply nodded and left the room, her heart still racing. Over the next few days, word spread quickly. The quiet girl who never spoke in class had left Mrs. Grayson speechless. Some students were impressed, others skeptical, but the whispers followed Elise wherever she went. She didn't like the attention, but there was no escaping it. Mrs. Grayson, meanwhile, couldn't seem to shake the incident. She began assigning more challenging problems in class, often directing them specifically at Elise. At first, it felt like a punishment, a way of testing her, of putting her back in her place. But every time, Elise rose to the challenge, solving the problems with a quiet confidence that made Mrs. Grayson's frustration grow. What Mrs. Grayson didn't know, what no one knew, was that Elise spent her evenings studying in advanced math textbooks she had borrowed from the library. Numbers were her escape, her way of making sense of a chaotic world. Her home life wasn't easy. Her father worked long hours at a factory, and her mother was often too sick to leave the house. Elise had learned to be self-reliant, to find joy in the things she could control. One afternoon, Mrs. Grayson called Elise to her desk after class. "I want you to join the math team," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Elise hesitated. "I'm not sure." "You're more than capable," Mrs. Grayson interrupted. "You'll be a valuable asset. And it's time you started pushing yourself." Elise wanted to protest, but something in Mrs. Grayson's expression stopped her. It wasn't the usual sternness. There was something almost hopeful in her eyes. Reluctantly, Elise agreed. As the weeks passed, Elise found herself spending more time in Mrs. Grayson's classroom after school, preparing for competitions. At first, their interactions were formal and strained. But gradually, something shifted. Mrs. Grayson began to see past Elise's quiet exterior, and Elise started to notice the cracks in Mrs. Grayson's tough facade. It turned out Mrs. Grayson's reputation for being strict wasn't just about maintaining discipline. It was about hiding her own insecurities. She had spent her entire career proving herself in a male-dominated field, and her tough exterior was a shield she had built to survive. But as much as Mrs. Grayson pushed Elise, she also began to learn from her. Elise's quiet determination, her ability to think outside the box, and her kindness toward her classmates started to challenge the way Mrs. Grayson approached teaching. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Middleton High School, casting long streaks of light across the shiny, freshly polished floors. Students shuffled down the hallways in their usual cliques, their laughter and chatter echoing faintly as they moved toward their classrooms. In room 203, however, the atmosphere was already tense. Mrs. Grayson, the school's notoriously strict math teacher, stood at the front of the room, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Mrs. Grayson was feared by nearly everyone at Middleton. With her sharp, no-nonsense tone and unrelenting standards, she had a reputation for making even the most confident students feel small. Her tall frame and piercing gaze commanded silence the moment she stepped into any room. "Excellence is the only acceptable standard," she often repeated, her words biting as they rang out in her unmistakable voice. In the corner of the classroom sat Elise. Quiet, unassuming, and perpetually overlooked, Elise was the kind of student no one really paid attention to. She was small for her age, with thick glasses that always slid down her nose and a preference for fading into the background. Other students rarely noticed her, and even when they did, it was only to tease her for her shyness or the outdated clothes she wore. But Elise had a secret. While she sat silently at her desk, scribbling in her notebook or staring out the window, she was solving problems that would stump even the brightest adults. Numbers, patterns, and puzzles fascinated her in a way that few people could understand. It wasn't something she flaunted. She didn't want the attention. But it was there, an extraordinary gift, hidden beneath her reserved demeanor. Mrs. Grayson had no patience for students like Elise. She preferred students who spoke up, who asserted themselves, who performed well under pressure. Elise's quiet nature annoyed her, and the fact that Elise never volunteered answers only reinforced Mrs. Grayson's belief that she was just another unmotivated, mediocre student. "Miss Hart," Mrs. Grayson said one day, her tone dripping with disdain as she glanced in Elise's direction. "Since you seem to have so much free time to daydream, why don't you come up here and solve this equation for the class?" The entire room went silent. Elise's heart pounded in her chest as she slowly stood up. She could feel every set of eyes on her, the heat rising in her face. Mrs. Grayson tapped the chalk impatiently against the board, the hint of a smirk on her lips. Elise hesitated as she approached the board, the complicated equation glaring back at her like a challenge she wasn't sure she could accept. Mrs. Grayson's tone softened just slightly, but it was laced with mockery. "Take your time," she said. "We wouldn't want you to get confused." The class chuckled under their breath, and Elise's grip tightened on the chalk. She stared at the equation, her mind racing. And then, in a moment that would later become the turning point of her life, Elise made a choice. Instead of retreating into herself like she always had, she decided to prove everyone wrong. Mrs. Grayson, the class, and anyone else who had ever underestimated her. Her hand moved quickly across the board, the numbers and variables forming patterns that only she could see. Mrs. Grayson's smirk began to fade as she realized Elise wasn't just scribbling random guesses. The room grew quieter, the air thick with anticipation. When Elise finally stepped back, the answer was there, clean and precise. The room was silent. Mrs. Grayson stared at the board, her mouth slightly open, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. The quiet girl she had written off as lazy or unremarkable had just solved an equation that would have given even the advanced students pause. Elise turned around, her eyes locking with Mrs. Grayson's. For the first time, she didn't look away. And in that moment, Mrs. Grayson realized she had made a terrible mistake. But this was only the beginning. What came next would challenge everything Mrs. Grayson thought she knew. Not just about Elise, but about herself.